Inserts, updates, and deletes. We talked a little bit in previous lectures about what an insert, update, and delete look like. We talked a little bit about what goes wrong. We're going to put that on the back burner for now. We're going to get the basics down first, and then we'll come back to what could go wrong. Now we're going to do this a couple different kinds of ways. We're going to first, using the components that are built into the .NET platform, we'll do inserts, updates, and deletes. Then we'll look at writing our own code to do it. And, I wouldn't favor one over the other. It's just that sometimes for a particular problem, you look at it and say it makes sense to do it this way. Other times you say it makes sense to do it that way. So it's worth it to know both ways of doing it, and then you can come up and decide what's right for the particular situation that you're going into. So let's go in here, and let me start up Visual Studio and open the faculty application that we've been working on for a while. It will take a while for this to come up, I'm sure. Which components do you suppose we're going to have to change for this to work? The data source or the grid view / details view to make this work? Okay, data source. Does anyone have another answer? Okay, that's correct. The real answer is we'll need to change both, right? We need to change the user interface to allow them to select something and say, I want to delete this. Because if you notice on our current examples, we didn't have that at all. We just were flat out displaying it. But you're absolutely right. The actual deletion itself is going to happen in the data source. So what we're going to do, I'm going to do a simple one, and we might do a couple of these throughout today. But we'll start out doing a simple one. And I'm going to do these, how do I want to say this? I'm going to do parts of this that we've already done. I'm not going to take one that we've already created and alter it. I'm going to create one from scratch just because going over it again and again and again typically is a decent way to review it. So we'll go and we'll do, when we create this grid view that we're going to delete from in a minute here, we'll create that, we'll create a brand new one. That way, just in case any review is necessary, or there was something wrong with the other ones or whatever, we'll start with a fresh slate. All right. Pretty exciting, huh? All right. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to create a new web form. And I will call it student MNT because it's going to display from the student file and will allow us to actually maintain the student table. I'm going to use the master file, master page that we have created. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to put my two controls that I need to pull up a grid of students. I'm going to pull up my grid view, and I'm going to pull up my data source. All right. So I will pull my grid view over. I will pull my SQL data source over. All right. I'm going to configure my data source. And I'm going to pick my connection string. Again, you should only have one connection string when you're done, one per database. Click Next. I'm going to use the little option here to specify columns from a table and view, and I'm going to pick the student table, and I'm going to pick the columns that I want to appear on the grid view, and I'll enumerate all of them to start. Okay. And I'll order by first last name, then first name. And since I want everything, I'm not doing any sort of query here. There's going to be no where clause, but I am going to click the advanced, because what the advanced will allow me to do is I have an option to generate the insert, update, and delete statements. So then, therefore, I can go in and I can generate the insert, update, and delete statements that are necessary to maintain this file. You can do this on your own. You can manually create them. We'll take a look at that at some point. But you know, you might as well let it do it for you. Typically, if I'm maintaining a table, I will only pull stuff from that one table. Now you might say, well, what if it links to another table? Well, if it links to another table, for example, student has a relationship with the faculty table, I'll still pull up the faculty ID from the student table, and then later on I'll go and add the drop-down. Similar to what you do in Access. If you're making a form that you want to maintain a table, it only pulls the column from that one table, and you then can create the interface however you want. So I'll click on this. Use optimistic concurrency. We'll talk about that later. All right. I can click Next, test my query, finish, and then I can go and, on the grid view, tie it to this source, SQL data source. And now, notice that there's some options that I don't believe were there before when we did a grid view. Because, yes?
Question, you skipped over that master's content real quick. What exactly did you do?
I clicked on the wrong thing. I clicked on, I think I clicked on that container, but I clicked on the wrong thing. I didn't click on the grid view. I think if you look back here,
like,
there's like two arrows right on top of each other. I clicked on the one instead of the other.
To master's content, and I was wondering what that meant.
Yeah. Yeah, that means, I suppose, if there is something in the master file for that content, it will use that. All right. I don't believe there were these two options before. Probably because none of the data sources that we used had the ability to edit and delete. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to select both of those to edit and delete. All right. And when you do that, it gives you two links, an edit link and a delete link. All right. So now we have configured our data source to allow updates and deletes, and we've also configured our grid view, our UI view, to allow edits and deletes. Notice that there's no insert. By default, there's no inserts allowed on a grid view. That isn't to say you couldn't manually code something, but the default behavior does not allow for inserts into it. If you think about the whole purpose of a grid view, showing a bunch of things from it, you know, those things you can either edit or you can delete. Let's look at the data view, or the data source rather. All right. I went and clicked custom just so that we could look at the SQL statements that are generated. It generates an update, an insert, and a delete. And if we look at these, we're not worried about the insert right this moment. We're going to worry about the delete and the update. But here's the delete that it generated. And we'll notice that it does very similar to what all the things that we've done with dynamic SQL are. That is, it uses a question mark to designate a parameter that's going to get filled in at runtime. All right. So delete from student where SID equals question mark. Again, how did it pick SID? Because that's the primary key of the table. That's the one way that we can guarantee that we're getting the one that we want. All right. If we were to delete by name, conceivably two people could have the same name, and you could end up deleting people that you didn't want to. All right. Whereas with the ID, only one person has a given student ID. If we were to look at the update statement, we will see something similar following the template of our update. Update table name student, set column name equals question mark, column name equals question mark, column name equals question mark, and so on, where SID equals question mark. All right. Now, if we look at the source for this, and I think it's a good idea, again, to know this. I've seen occasions where Visual Studio has generated incorrect things. So it's helpful if you can look and you at least know what's going on. But we can look and, let me make this bigger. Notice that our SQL data source has a select command, which is a query that gets run, but that update, insert, and delete command that we saw on that previous screen, this is where it actually lives in the code. All right. So as part of this SQL data source control, we have this as a delete command that's going to get executed when we issue a delete. Notice what also we have. We also have a set of parameters that are tied to the grid view. So in other words, where are we going to get the value to delete? Well, we're going to get it from the SID column of the grid view. In the update statements, where do we get the value for last name and first name and address and so on? We get them from their respective fields in the grid view. So what I want you to pay attention to is this has an insert statement, a delete statement, and an update command. I should say command rather than statement. And those commands all have parameters. And the parameters are represented by those question marks. All right? Those question marks are filled in from the different values in the grid view based on these parameters here. If, for example, we were to switch some of these parameters, we're liable to get things updated the wrong way. All right? Or if there weren't, again, I've seen happen before is where the number of parameters didn't match the question marks that are in the command, just for some fluke condition. So it pays to be able to look at this and sort of understand what's going on with that. All right, let's see this in action. Now, when we see this in action, prepare to be underwhelmed. All right? If that's even a word. Remember, the intent of a framework is not to do all your work for you. Right? The intent of a framework is to give you a basis on which to do your work, a starting point. All right? Therefore, this grid view will allow us to delete and will allow us to update, but it's not going to be like finished, good, and polished. All right? It's not going to be up to production quality. I'll show you a couple ways how that is. One way that it is that delete command, sure enough, goes out and deletes it. So we want to delete John Doe. Boom, they're gone. What if you click the wrong thing? It's too bad. He's gone. All right? So that's probably not that good, right? We probably would want some sort of confirmation. And we'll look at how we can do that in a bit. All right? So that's the one thing that's wrong. The other thing that's wrong is when we go into edit mode, watch what happens. I click on edit. It will put all the editable fields, in this case, everything but the primary key, right? Because the primary key typically we don't want to change. It'll put all of them into a series of text boxes. Well, that's okay for some of these things. For example, last name, yeah, that should be a text box. Address, that should be a text box. But state probably would be better off being a drop-down, right? And class, whether they're a freshman, a junior, a senior, or a sophomore, that should be in a drop-down as well. And lastly, faculty ID is just literally the ID, all right? And would have to know the proper ID to change it to the person that we wanted it to. And that's obviously not good. So again, this is a nice start, but it's not really ready for prime time, as they say. Now, we can go in, if we hit cancel, that simply backs us out and doesn't make any of those changes. Or we can go and make a change and update it, and our change is then reflected in the database. So the idea is that without too much pain, we can create something, some forms that will allow us to change values in the database. That's the good news. The bad news is we can create them, but they're not like production ready. They're not of a high quality. There's a lot of things obviously wrong with that. Let's look at some more things that are wrong with it. If we go in, should we be able to save someone that doesn't have a name? Of course not. In fact, we do that and we get a very ugly error. We never want to give these sorts of errors to our users. We would want some sort of validation to happen that would say that that's not allowed. Likewise, we can go type any old number here for their faculty advisor, whether or not that number exists or not. And when we click update, we get something that we understand what that means, but a typical user wouldn't understand what it means. So not very user-friendly. All right? But it did it quick. What does that mean? That means at least it did some of your work for you. So that's good. All right? If someone comes and does the dishes for me half the time, I'd be happy. I'll do it the other half of the time instead of doing it every single day. All right? The other thing is this makes us good for doing sort of quick prototyping. If, for example, you wanted to prototype something, a prototype being something that isn't a completed product but is close enough to give people, to communicate the idea and to give people an idea of what's going on, you have a nice little real quick prototyping tool by doing stuff like this. So that's sort of the good news. All right? We'll come back and fix these things probably in a few minutes today. All right? Let's sort of keep a mental inventory of what we didn't like. All right? Number one thing we didn't like is that there were some columns that were text boxes that would probably be better off being drop-downs or radio buttons or something else. The other thing is that there's no validation. All right? The other thing is that when we get an error, it gives us an error spectacularly. All right, it just blows up. That will be the same with deletes as well. For example, I don't know how the foreign keys are set up in this table, but if something was prevented from being deleted because of a cascading delete, then when we tried to delete it, it would give us a really ugly error, just like this. All right, let's move on to. In fact, let's go before we move on. Let's go in and let's make sure. Let's rig the deck and make sure that there is a foreign key that will keep us from deleting some students. So let's go into Tools, and I'll go in and I'll make a foreign key between student and enrollment. There already is a foreign key. I will, oh, it's not set to cascade, so good. There's an enrollment row in here for a student ID of 1, Sarah. So we're not able to delete Sarah. So let's go here and let's try to delete Sarah. And we'll get an error. Boom. Can't be deleted because there's rows in the table in enrollment. So there was a restricted delete on that table already. Okay. So let's just sort of keep a mental inventory of those three things. The ugly error message that we get, the fact that in editing it would be nice if there was some sort of validation, and it would be nice if in editing that there were drop downs as opposed to just plain old text fields. Okay, so let's go now and let's create a detail view for student. Yes?
Real quick question.
Huh?
How did you get from your project over into the Access database?
Oh, I just clicked on the item on the.
Oh, you had it.
Yeah. I don't think I had Access open. I think I had that folder open, so I clicked on that, and I think I had like this folder open, so I clicked on that, and then went into App Data and double clicked. Yeah. No magic.
There was a magic.
No. Yes.
Some of those columns can be confusing. You know how you name stuff in the database?
Yes.
Somebody looking at it doesn't know what FID means.
Right.
In that case, in your web app, you can just edit the column and make it display a different name.
Yeah, absolutely. What we would do, again, is we can go into the grid view here, and we could say edit columns, and we could go in for each of the columns and change the header. For example, student ID is SID. We could say student number.
And that doesn't affect the database.
No, no. Student number, we could go here and say last name, and so on. I don't do it just out of the interest of time, but yeah, absolutely. And you would want to do that, you know. I suppose that's another way where this isn't ready for prime time, is it just does it very quick and dirty for you, and you'd have to go in and clean some of that up if you wanted it to work right. Okay. So let's go in and let's make a details view, and we'll see how to do it with the details view. And really, the details view is very, very, very similar to the grid view. So we'll go in and we'll do that. One thing to keep in mind, this is getting to a statement I made way earlier in the course, that a lot of times, even if you don't want to display the student number, let's say, or whatever the primary key is, you'll want it in the data source just so that you can go in, or you want it in the data source in the grid view just so you can go in and delete it if you need it. All right? Use it, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. You don't want to delete it. You would want to use it in a deletion or use it in an update. So in this case, student ID, even if I didn't want to display it, I would want to keep it around so that it could be used in these SQL statements. All right, let's go in here and let's go into the grid view and let's edit columns and let's go and add a hyperlink column. All right, this will be our link to our student detail page. All right, so we'll click Add to add that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, for the text of this, I'm not going to pull a value from the database. I'm just going to make the text the word detail. Maybe, if I can type the word detail, I will. All right. Now, the URL field, again, that's what we want to pass on the URL. And typically, again, that's going to be the primary key because we want to, on the detail page, the one page with the details view, we want to pull up the proper row from the database. So in order to do that, we have to pull, or use rather, the student ID. And the navigate will be something like student mntdet.aspx, and I'll do the question mark ID equals curly bracket 0 curly bracket. All I'm doing is I've given the name of the page. I haven't made the page yet, but so I'll remember this when I go and create it. And I have said how I'm going to get from, how I'm going to pass from this page to that page the value that it needs. Well, if that second page is going to pull up information about one student, what does it need? What do you need to pull up the information about one student? The student ID. So therefore, I'm going to put the student ID somewhere on the query string. Where am I going to put it? Well, I'm going to put it at the very end after ID equals, putting that 0th field on that list. So I'm putting that there. Now, let's go in and create our detail page. And I called it student mntdet. Clone it from that master page. All right. And away we go. I'll go and I'll drag a details view over instead of a grid view. And I will drag my SQL data source over. Go and configure it. Want that same connection. Pick from the student table all the different fields that I want in the select. All right. Advanced, I want to generate the insert, update, and delete. I'm also going to pull up a where clause. 1 second, because I don't want to pull up all the students. I only want to pull up that one student that was passed, whose ID was passed on the query string. Yes?
On this screen, because we usually do this, specify the customer SQL. We cannot do that because we need the advanced option. Am I correct?
Oh no, you can still do that. Yeah, I'm just doing it simpler. Just to do this first example a little bit simpler. I'm sure over the course of the next few weeks we'll do it the other way as well. All right. So I'll put in my where clause and I will say I want where the SID matches something from the query string. What value from the query string? The ID field. Then remember to hit add. I guarantee before the semester's over I'll do this and forget to hit add. That adds it to the list of part of the where clause. All right. And I will go and grab. All right, you see that's what I did. I clicked on the content, yeah, where I wanted actually this one, and choose data source. See, it's a good thing I'm consistent in my mistakes. You know, that way I can repeat the mistake and answer any questions. All right. So now let's go, and I'm going to set this as my start page. I'm going to run this, and we'll see how now it works with the detail view. Now, in this particular case, the detail view is sort of redundant, right? Because my grid view contains all the columns from that table. Typically, that won't be the case. Typically, you might pick 2 or 3 columns from the table and show those on the grid view, and then show all of the tables that are related on the details view. All right. So now and again, notice that those names are changed. Now, if I go and click Detail, if I mouse over the detail, we can see on the very bottom of the screen the URL changes. And on the end of each URL, student mntdet.asbx $ID equals, the number that follows the equal sign is the primary key of that table, the student number. So now I click this, detail, and, ooh, no edit and delete. I forgot to check those on the detail view. Just like with the grid view, to enable deletion and insertion and updating, you have to say that that's okay to do. Both on the, we have to have the SQL to do it in the SQL data source. We have to tell the user interface, yeah, it's okay to do that. All right. Now, this brings up an interesting, what would I call this? Sort of an interesting implication here. All right. Let's keep in mind a couple of things. First of all, we know that this is an object-oriented platform. And we know that we can change just about anything related to an object. Any of the object's attributes we can change either through our development mode. We can give sort of initial values to them. But more importantly, we can change some of these attributes through code. All right? If you remember, we made things appear and disappear. All right? We changed values of text boxes. We've done a lot of different things where we've written some code, and based on certain conditions, we've changed things. How do you think we could take advantage of these attributes? In other words, I deliberately had to go in and select that we were able to insert, edit, and delete it. Well, it wasn't automatically given that. How could we maybe use that to our advantage in some sort of application? Any thoughts on that? Go in the code behind and code it yourself to change those things. When practically might we want to do that? Can you think of like a practical example of when we would want to go and do that? Well, what I'm thinking of is an application where maybe based on permissions you were allowed to do things or not. For example, on my blog, I'm allowed to go and edit my blog posts. But you know what? No one else can edit my blog posts. So it could look to see who was logged on or who was viewing it, and look to see if I was logged on. And if I was logged on, then it could enable the edit or whatever. So you could do this as sort of a security measure if there were different sort of users that had different permissions on how to do things. Whether it be on a public website or an intranet site or any sort of site. That if there were sort of dynamic permissions where people could do things based on that, you might be able to do that. Look at it this way. Imagine if this was a web application for employees at Loring Community College. Some people may have permission to view students. Other people may have permission to go ahead and change students. Well, by doing some sort of checking there, you could dynamically turn on and off those things to keep people from being able to access that. All right? So, now we go and enable those. And we can run this. And now we should be back in business to be able to insert, update, and delete on that grid. All right. So I'll go and click Detail. There it is. Now we have Edit, Delete, and New. If we click Delete, it's going to try to get rid of it like that. And again, it's not able to because there's rows in the enrollment table. If we click Edit, we have really the same restrictions that we had before, the same issues we had before. That is, we could save people, there's no validation to make sure that there's a name associated with that. And they're all text box, they're not drop downs. And if we get an error, the error is going to be displayed very ugly. So just like the grid view, the same sort of limitations. And nicely enough, the way to fix it is about the same as well. So we'll go and do that. All right. But the other thing that we have is we have the ability to click New and to go in and add a new student. And I know I did that backwards. I am too lazy to correct it. And I click Insert. And I get an error because one of the fields is I left a field blank that shouldn't be blank. Maybe that? I don't know. All right. Actually, I'm still having a problem. We can look and we can debug that later. Or actually, let's try to debug that now. I think I'll bet I know the problem. Well, guess again. I was thinking that maybe the student ID was not an auto number field. But let's go and look. This is the kind of thing where it's important to be able to read the code, right? We know the insert statement is going wrong, and we know where that is in the code. So let's go and look at that. All right. The insert statement. Inserted the student. SID, SL name, SF name, blah, 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 blah. What's wrong with that picture? SID is actually an auto number key, therefore it shouldn't be part of the insert. So I'm going to go in and manually correct that. I'm going to go in and get rid of that there. Get rid of the one question mark. And then get rid of it from the parameters. So now it should work okay. The problem is there was no value for the SID, and it was trying to do it in an insert. All right. Whereas, because that's an auto number key, we don't want to manually insert our own value. We want the database to generate its own value. All right. This is where being able to read the code can save you tons. That would be, dare I say, virtually impossible to look at and stare and figure out going through the GUI. Let me rephrase that. It might not be as hard as I made it out to be. But in my mind, being able to look at the code, you can see exactly what it's doing. You don't have to play around with the GUI. And keeping in mind that sometimes the GUI, is there to sort of shield things from you and so on. You can see right into the code. Now let's go in and try this and try to make it work. Okay. I have that table open in Access, so it's not going to let me open it here. All right. Now we go into details. We can go into insert and we can type in all right. Notice what happened is it brought back up the person that I initially brought up. All right, because again, it still had that on the query string. If we go back, though, to the grid, we'll notice that I am, in fact, added there. That brings us to two other things that are wrong with this default arrangement. First of all, when I'm done, after I've added, I probably don't want to redisplay that person. I probably want to go back to the grid in this case. Secondly, notice how awkward it is to add someone. If I wanted to add a new person, I'd have to click add, or I'm sorry, I'd have to go and click the details link and then pull up a person and then click new. I should be able to just click new and have it. All right. Again, never fear, we can program any of this. All right. So therefore, what we're going to do over the next while is we're going to fix all the things that we don't like about this. The fact that there's no drop-downs, the fact that there's no validation, the fact that we're getting ugly error messages, the fact that after we're done inserting, it doesn't go back to the grid, and the fact that we have to first pull up someone before we can go and insert them. Yes?
Quick question. If you made the changes on the grid view,
Uh-huh.
and you left a couple of fields blank,
Yes.
would that screw up the join statement where you might not get the details view listed? Because like on your last lecture, you don't have each field.
Yeah,
Another one.
it would depend on what the details view was. Keep in mind, because I'm maintaining these tables, my selects have only been from one table, which is typically the way I like to do it. If I'm maintaining a table, that is, if I'm adding, inserting, and deleting from it, I will have that be the only table in that grid view, and that be the only table in the SQL statement. If I need to refer to other tables, I'll do that via drop-downs or whatever. All right, so those are the problems that we want to try to fix. All right, and we'll bang on this until we fix all of them. All right, so let's pick one. First things first, let's fix the deletion. All right, what didn't we like about the deletion? If I remember right, we didn't like two things about the deletion. We didn't like the fact that the second you click delete, they were gone. All right, with no confirmation of it. The second thing that we didn't like is that if the delete fails, we get a very, very ugly error message. We don't get anything that's intelligible. All right, so let's fix those two things. All right. Let's first look at the deletion confirmation. Now we'll look at the ugly error message first. Then we'll look at the deletion confirmation. All right. Let's look at the problem that we're trying to fix. And then we'll talk about it. If I go and click delete, I get a very ugly error. And I get an error that is not going to be meaningful to anyone but another programmer. In fact, the way that .NET Security is set up, the only reason I'm getting this error that looks like this is because I'm running where my client and web server are the same machine. Really, the default security in .NET is not to give even this descriptive of an error to the outside world. Why? Because hackers could potentially use information about what database tables you have and so on. So if you're running on a remote site, if for example if this web server was somewhere else, a production web server, and I got this error, the error would be even more cryptic than this. All right. So that's one of the things that takes a OK program and makes it good, is that it handles errors gracefully. Now remember the kinds of errors that we can get. We can get errors that we talked about, foreign key errors, referential integrity errors, other constraint errors, and there's all those whole slew of things that are unforeseen. All right. The way that's typically handled in most programming environments is through the use of a try-catch block. How many of you have used or have seen a try-catch block before in coding? All right. We'll look at them in more detail, but the problem here is normally what you do with a try-catch block is something like this. You put your statements wrapped up in a try statement. And then you catch any exceptions or errors that occur. We'll go over this in more detail in a future class. But to be able to do this, it requires us having code to do it for. All right? Where's the code that does a delete? Well, it's not in the ASPX file, right? That's not where our processing code is. It must be in the code behind file then, right? Let's look in the code behind file. Our code behind file is empty. Where is the code that actually does the delete? It's not in the ASPX file. It's not in our code behind. Pardon me? No, it's not really there. The actual code that says go and do this, that's actually part of the framework. That's actually part of those components, part of those built-in objects, is the code that actually goes, and you're right in the sense that the SQL statement is there, but the code that goes and tells that SQL statement to execute is actually built somewhere in the framework. All right? And we don't have access to that code. All right? It's a proprietary framework, so we can't wrap a try-catch around that code. So what do? Well, the developers of of ASP.NET gave us a couple of hooks into a couple of events that we can look at to determine whether a SQL statement works successfully or not. All right? If you look under the events, and we'll look under the events of that grid view, actually, I lied. We'll look under the events of the data source. Notice that there's three pairs of words, one of which is in the present tense and one of which is in the past tense. There is a deleting and a deleted event. What I'm looking at, again, is I'm looking at the built-in control in the framework, the SQL data source. I'm looking to see what events are associated with that. So associated with my SQL data source, there is a deleting and a deleted event. There's also an inserting and an inserted event. Finally, there is an updating and updated event. The present tense one, the one that ends in ing, fires up before the actual database operation takes place. So inserting, that code is code that will be executed before the actual insert is done. Inserted, then, is code that gets executed after the insert has been attempted. Insert has been attempted. So, what's going to be the code that's going to run where we can check to see if the delete statement worked or not? What event are we going to put that code in? Well, it's probably not insert or inserting or updating or updated. It's probably either deleted or deleting. Where do we want to put the code to see if it worked? Deleted, right? Because that statement has been attempted at that point. And we can then look and see that. So, a way to handle the errors more gracefully is to look and write some code in the deleted event. Because in the deleted event, that deletion has already been attempted. And it either worked or it didn't work. All right? And now we can look to see if it didn't work, and we can clean up the piece, clean up the dust if it got an error. I'm going to go on to the GUI here, and I'm going to put a text box for an error message. Actually, I'm going to put a label for an error message. And I'll call it label error. That's where I'm going to display my nice user-friendly error message. All right. So back to the code behind. So how do we tell if it succeeded or failed? All right. Well, this variable e contains information about what just happened or what's about to happen. In this case, because we're talking about the deleted event, this parameter e, this object e, contains information about what just happened. All right? One of the attributes of that object is an exception object. So, we can test this e.exception variable to see if there's an exception or not. Now, how is this going to work? If there's an exception, that object is going to have a value. If there was no error, if the deletion went fine and there was no error, that exception object is going to be null. It's going to be a null object. So, if I said, if e.exception is nothing, what does that mean? It means that there's no exception object, which means that no error occurred. So an e.exception being nothing means that there was no error. There's a nothing error. There's no error. So this is where we got to remember we're programmers and not English teachers. We're going to say if the exception is not nothing. All right? What's not nothing? Not nothing is something. So if it's not nothing, it must be something. And therefore, if it's something, that means that there's an error. So the wording looks a little goofy the first few times that you see it, but trust me, it'll be second nature pretty quickly. So we're going to ask if that exception object is not nothing. All right? If it's not nothing, then we have an error. And what can we do? We can display a message in that text box. Yes?
Well, why would it matter either way? Why couldn't you just check if it was nothing? If it was nothing, then you would know it was okay, right?
Yeah, but I wanna do something if it is not okay. So I could do this. You're right. I could do this. Else, I could put my code there. But a lot of people frown on that code. All right? Frown on that style of code. Because there's no true part to the if statement. There's only an else. Frankly, I don't care. You could do it that way. But you could also do it this way. And put in the error code. All right? Now, in this case, what do we want to do? Well, we want to set our label error to something. problem deleting. And you could probably do something like possible causes. Related data in related tables. And then maybe an action that they could take. Email dhuffman@lorainccc.edu. Now, oops. Oh, label error.text. Okay. One more thing we have to do. We have to tell the framework, hey, we got this one handled. All right? And we do that by saying e.exceptionHandled equals true. That effectively is saying, hey, we took care of that problem. We're aware that the problem occurred and we dealt with it. So therefore, framework, you don't have to deal with this kind of error. All right? We got it. You don't have to do any of your processing. Because if we put that text up and we don't say that we handled it, then the framework still thinks it needs to handle it, and the framework's still going to do its thing. So now let's go run this and see what we got. All right, so we go and try to delete this person. Problem deleting, possible causes, and so on. Much more user-friendly error. It tells them what happened. It gave them an idea of maybe why that happened, and it will give them some information about what they can do if they need this done. All right? Questions about this?
On that e-exception,
Mm-hmm.
you said that if it is null, that means there is no error. And if there's something there, there is some kind of an error.
Right.
Is that something there has a value?
Yes. That's a great question. The question is what exactly is in that exception object? All right, we already identified that G. If it's nothing, that means that there's no error. Well, what if there is an error? What is that something that's in there? And that something is an exception object. Actually, each object has, or each kind of exception has an exception object. Let's go in and let's put a second label underneath this. All right, I put a second label here. We can actually pull values from that exception. So, for example, we have a couple of possibilities. One is a message that's associated with it that tells us what kind of exception it is. And one is the toString, which will take the exception and format it as a string. Let's just, for laughs, let's put in that I want to set that second message field, or second error message field, I'm going to set it to equal to the message associated with that exception. All right, and notice what that is. That is actually more precise. That's exactly what happened. That enrollment contains related records. So notice how piecing together a little bit of language that we wrote ourselves and pulling the precise error from that gives something that's at least somewhat understandable, as opposed to that big, giant, ugly error that we have no idea what to do and where we're at. All right. If we do the toString, I believe that gives the whole giant error message that we had seen before. Yeah, gives that whole trace, which again is probably not anything that we would want to display. But something like this, yeah, the message part along with that, certainly looks like a reasonable thing. So, we can do this to any of the SQL operations. I did it with the deletion there just because it was a nice, easy one to do. But I could also do it for the updated. I could do it on the grid view the details view on the inserted, and so on. All right. It's a good idea to have this even if you have other sorts of validation in your code. All right. It's a good idea to do that even if you have other sorts of validation. Because, again, you never know when you're going to have some sort of off-the-wall, totally unexpected or unanticipated error. You know, in fact, I just had one before, if you remember, when I kept that student table open and I went and tried to do something. That's not something I would necessarily think I'd get, but sure enough, I got it. So therefore, it's good to have this kind of code anywhere you're doing a deletion or any database operation. Let's see. Remember, again, on that SQL data source, we have selected. So we could even put that code in there so that if something went wrong with the query, it would display. Or updated, or inserted, and we did deleted. Same thing works on the details view, as you can imagine, because, again, all this stuff is on the data source, not on the UI. All right, I'm going to start the next big bit of cleanup. Keep in mind, as I'm cleaning these things up and getting rid of the errors, I'm just going to demonstrate. I'm not necessarily going to do everything in them. For example, I probably should put the same code in the updated event as well. All right. Okay. The next issue that we want to address relates to the fact that there's no validation at all in any of this. The default behavior is that there's no validation. You simply get a text box and you can go change away that text box. Well, how do we get it so that there is validation? Well, this is where we're going to make use of what are called template columns. Okay? Template columns are used whenever you want to deviate from the default behavior. So the default behavior for editing is what? Text box, no validation. So if you want something else to happen, for example, validation, drop down instead of a text box, or anything like that, then you have to convert the column into a template column. Okay? So, let's go and do that. I'm going to go into this grid view, edit columns, and I'm going to start out with last name. All right, because if you remember, last name was one of those fields that we got in trouble with because we were able to try to save a student without a last name. And our database didn't like that because people have to have last names. So I'm going to go and click on that little link down there that says, convert this field into a template field. Okay? So now that last name is a template field. Well, what does that mean? That means if we look at the grid view, we can go and we can edit those template fields. And we'll see all the template fields that exist. In our case, we only have the one template field. We have the last name template. Because that's the only field that we converted to a template field. Now notice what we have. We have the item template. We have an alternating item template. We have an edit item template. We have a header template and a footer template. The three we're going to be interested in really is, or the one that we're going to be interested in is the edit item template. We'll talk about these other two. This simply tells us, depending on the mode that the grid view is in, how we're going to display it. For example, if we're just viewing the grid view, we're just viewing the item on the page, it's going to be put in a label. Notice that when we first go into that page with the grid view, until we click Edit on one of the items, one of the rows, all the views, or all the fields are simply in labels. None of them are in text boxes. The Edit Item template is the view that we're going to have when we click Edit for that row. And if we notice, it's a text box. Well, in the case of last name, we want to keep it as a text box, right? We just want to add some validation. So, what am I going to do? I'm going to go and add a required field validator right smack dab in the middle of that template. And I will say that that required field validator I must have missed it. Go, control to validate. I want it to be text box 1, which guess what is that text box. Now, we can't put this validator on the page like we did back in the first few assignments. Why? Because that text box isn't always there, right? That text box only is there when the grid view is in certain modes, namely when it's in edit mode. That's why we convert it to a template, because then with this template field, we can then go and we can put in code that relates to how it's going to behave when it's in that special mode. So when we're displaying simply a grid, it still is going to show the last name in a label. But when we go into edit mode, it's going to display that last name with a required field validator associated with it. All right. So now let's go in and let's try this. And I go in here to edit. All right. If I go and try to update and there's no last name, I get the error message. So we have to have a name before we can go and save it. Now, we'll come back to this. If this part wasn't clear, we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about template fields. The key thing to remember about template fields is that they are your off-the-board solution. All right? When you don't like the way the default behavior is behaving, the template field allows you to go in and customize for each mode, for each template that grid is in, when it's in display mode or insert mode or edit mode. You can go in and define the way that particular column is going to appear and is going to act. So when we want to go and make faculty ID a drop-down instead of a text box where you type in the ID, guess what we're going to do? We're going to convert that to a template field. We're going to delete the text box out of there. We're going to pull over a drop-down and have that drop-down populated. All right? So again, anytime we want to do anything sort of out of the ordinary, we're going to convert it to a template. And in that way, we can chip away at these little issues that we had with the default right out of the box functionality and get to the place where it is sort of, where it is something that is production worthy. Questions or comments? Yes?
Question. That convert template.
Yes.
That is only for if I'm going to be using a grid view or a detail view.
Yes.
If I design my own, we don't need that one because we can also.
If you design your own form, then you're doing everything. You can put the behavior how you want. Right. Exactly. Yes.
Is there a way to quickly go over how you added that detail view again and how you linked just that URL part where it had the 0 and
Yeah.
brackets? Just didn't know.
Yeah. Let's go and revisit that. First of all, let's make sure we understand this. That there's going to be the grid, which is going to link to the details page. So we got to know two things about the details page for this to work, right? We have to know the name of the detail page, right? Duh, all right? Student, and we made it student mntdet.aspx. Now, the other thing we have to know is we have to know how this page, or rather, we have to know where this page is expecting the necessary information to pull up the right student, right? Because the difference between the grid view and the details view is the detail view is only pulling up one student, whereas the grid view pulled up all of them. So we have to somehow tell the details view which student we want. All right? So how do you refer to an individual row in a database table? By the primary key. So what we're going to do is the full URL for this grid view is going to be student mntdet.aspx plus, we're going to add on to the end of that, question mark, ID equals, and then that ID is going to contain the primary key or the student ID of the student that we want. All right? Because that page has to know which student to pull up. So, now on the grid view then, when we create that link, part of that link is going to be hard-coded. This part's the same for every student. The only thing that's different is the exact ID. The details view then has code in it to pluck the ID field off of the URL and use that to do the query. All right? Now, what we have to do is we have to write the grid view to properly create that URL. So, how do I do that? I do that by, when I create my hyperlink field, in the data navigation URL format string is the hard-coded part of the URL. In other words, the part that I always want to call. That is student mntdet.aspx question mark ID equals. All right. Remember, that's the part that's the same on each one. What's different for each row? I want to put a parameter there. I want to put specifically the value of the student ID. Now, how does this translate to student ID? Well, in the field above it, I have the fields from the database that I want to include on the URL. And which field do I want to include on the URL? I want to include the student ID. So I put student ID there. Curly bracket 0, curly bracket simply means the first field on that list. And since we're only passing one field, and it's typically going to just be curly bracket 0. If you pass two fields, then you'd have braces 0 and braces 1. All right. So that's the mechanism by which now that link is created, and the first part of it's the same for each one, but that bracket 0 represents that particular student's student ID. So then that link is created. The second page then was written so that oops, there we go. The student ID in that SQL statement gets filled in from the thing on the query string as a value of ID. That's what sort of brings it together. This is code on the second page that says, hey, which student do you want to pull up? The one who has this as a student ID. All right. Other questions? Yes?
Okay. Going back to the other window, the one that we specify the curly bracket.
Right.
In this example, we have SID.
Correct.
Let's say I need two columns
Right.
to satisfy
The primary key, right.
so I have to specify SID, comma, let's say first name.
Yeah. Let's say, for example, if for whatever reason the primary key was the student number plus the state that they were from, all right, or something goofy like that. What we would have to do is do this then, is we'd have to go in here and enter the strings one per line. So we'd put in SID, state, and it would go there, yeah. And then when we did this, would say ID equals that, and state equals braces 1. Whoops. Yeah. And again, remember these names here are just names I made up. It doesn't have to be ID and state. I have to keep in mind what that second page is expecting. And that second page was expecting something called ID, so I do that. It's not expecting anything called state, but that's okay. We're going to give it to it anyhow. It's not going to use it for anything. Now if we go and do this, if we look, we will see, if we look at that link that's created, if you look down there, the link is student MNT det.aspx ? ID equals 38 ampersand state equals WI. So we're passing both those fields on the query string. So if you had a multiple part key, for example, and you wanted to pass that key from the grid to the details view, you'd have to pass both parts of the key, and that's how you do it. You'd simply specify the two fields that you wanted to pass as part of the URL, and then you'd format the URL the way you wanted to, with the braces 0 representing the first field on the list and braces 1 representing the second field on that list. And obviously you could go from there and pass as many as you wanted to. All right, other questions? All right, we'll see you up in lab then. Question was, how did that link column get put on the grid view?
Yeah.
Yeah. What I did is I just went into the grid view and said edit columns, and I just went in and I picked the column I wanted and clicked add. All right.